Hello everybody, how are we doing today? In this video, I want to talk about the future of Final Fantasy and the current state that it's in. So in terms of sales, Final Fantasy has been on a bit of a seesaw, and the glass ceiling for the series would ideally be Final Fantasy VII, the initial release on PlayStation 1, which sold close to 11 to 12 million copies. So that's our glass ceiling. That is essentially the highest selling title, not including re-releases, remakes, remasters, just standalone initial releases. So, with that being said, the current glass ceiling, we could say, the highest potential the series has reached is 11 to 12 million units. Now, for a single-player JRPG, that's not bad at all. If anything, we all know that the original Final Fantasy VII really ushered in the JRPG genre and took it to where it's at today. So, how has Final Fantasy been since then, and why am I starting with 7? Well, one, because it's the highest-selling initial release in the series, and two, Final Fantasy really took off once it started to release on Sony's home consoles and not Nintendo's. The SNES games typically sold between 2 to 3 million copies on the high end, and most of that was coming from Japan, with a couple 100,000 coming from the States. Final Fantasy VII changed that, where really the States picked up a lot of the slack, and the series grew tremendously here, and it also continued to grow domestically in Japan as well. So after that, it's kind of been all over the place. We've got 8, which is around 8 to 9 million units. We have 9, which dropped off pretty big, about 5.5 million units. I believe that does include the PC and the PS4 release, so we can say probably likely closer to 4 to 5 million units on PS1. Now, to be fair, it did release in the year of 2000, and it was more of a traditional Final Fantasy game, if that makes any sense. Hironobu Sakaguchi came back and really helmed that game, and the PS2 was kind of starting to become a thing, so that one's in a unique spot. Then we have Final Fantasy X, which is around that 8 to 10 million units as well. Standalone release on PlayStation 2. We have X-2, the first sequel, which did about 5.5 million units. And then we have 12, I'm not counting the MMOs here, which released and sold between 6 to 7 million units, right? So yeah, we're kind of still in that wheelhouse, right? That 11 to 12 million threshold. We're definitely not hitting there, but we're definitely still kind of within the realm of what you would expect each title to release. But here's the thing. As development and time goes on, these budgets go up. So theoretically, these sales projections have to increase in terms of Square Enix to get a return on investment on these games. And that's not to say that they're not profitable, they just could be doing a lot better. And here's my reasoning as to why. Once we take a look into the PS3 era, we have Final Fantasy XIII, which went multi-platform. And I believe between the 360 and the PS3, Final Fantasy XIII sold around 7.7 million units, I believe. Final Fantasy XIII also was a trilogy, and diminishing return on investments on each release. I believe the sequel sold 3 to 4 million, and I think Lightning Returns sold close to like 2 to 3 million, maybe even less than that. So diminishing returns, right? And obviously Final Fantasy was in a weird spot with sequels, which was not really traditional. I mean, we had X-2, we have Revenant Wings on the DS, which if you would count that as a sequel to 12, but it was in a pretty awkward spot in the PS3 days. It really dropped off. Now, the weird thing is, during this time we had Final Fantasy Versus 13 and yada yada yada. We all know the story behind this. It had got announced in 2006, had the weirdest, rockiest development. It essentially got rebranded in 2013 as Final Fantasy 15. Now, this game is really unique. One, because of its launch lead up. 2, because of its insane marketing. There was a movie, there was an anime, There was a tie-in game, there was mobile games. It was released on PS4, Xbox One, came to PC, went to Google Stadia, had a Pocket Edition. This game was just all over the place. But essentially, as of May 2022, it reached 10 million units in sales, which closer to that glass ceiling, which is a good thing, right? And my answer to that is yes and no, because the game was obviously profitable for Square Enix, but the time and the resources they put into it for it to get to that threshold, I mean, this game, like I said, was marketed to no end, had an essential 10-year build-up, tons of patches and DLCs, an online multiplayer mode that didn't last that long. This game just like lived, and it was almost felt like it was shoved down your throat. It was everywhere, but it was a humongous game, and it deserved the sales that it got, right? And I'm not going to undermine that, but it was a very unique situation for Final Fantasy 15. So then that brings us to 16, which as of now, we know that so far it has sold 3 million units just on PS5 with its lower install base. That definitely means something, but it doesn't mean everything. So obviously sales will continue to grow, and Square Enix has an 18-month sales strategy for the game since its release. So I'm going to say, take estimates and say maybe it's around 4 to 5 million units now just on PS5, which in theory is not that bad, but it's also not that great considering the budget of the game. It probably has made its money back, but returns have probably not as much as the previous game. And then I missed 7 Remake, which that we're going to talk about in a little bit when we get to Rebirth. But 16, yeah, definitely in a weird spot. It'll continue to grow. It's about to release on PC in a couple of days here, so that's got its potential to rise in sales as well. And critically, it has been received very well. So I think the game could potentially have legs. It's had 2 DLCs released, which were great. So I think the game can get somewhere, right? I think it can still stay within the wheelhouse of what we've been seeing in the series so far. Obviously, Square Enix spent a lot more developing Final Fantasy 16 than they did 10, 13, 15, 12, right? So to still be within that same wheelhouse of sales numbers and the game to cost more to develop, obviously you're getting diminishing returns, and that's not something a company would want, especially for a standalone series like Final Fantasy, where you're essentially buying one package, one game. Of course, sometimes it'll have DLC and things of that nature, but it's not a live service game. You're not continuously paying into it. It is hopeful that you buy the game day one at full price, so Square Enix can get as much money as possible and get the biggest return on investment they possibly can, right? So that brings us to Rebirth, and we don't have any official sales numbers yet, but it's expected that Rebirth is not doing too well. We know that Final Fantasy VII Remake on PC, on PS5, the integrated version, and on PS4, it sold 7 million units, which this one's tricky too, because 1, it's a remake of a trilogy, and 2, it's really hard to kind of throw 7 Remake in there, because it's a remake, right? It's essentially 7 already exists in some aspect. Obviously, Square Enix probably wanted to do more. In my personal opinion, I think 7 million for the first game that only takes place in Midgar isn't too bad, but also like you'd kind of expect more. And then we have Rebirth, which reviewed incredibly well, could potentially be Game of the Year. It's my personal Game of the Year. I've had a blast with it. I'm still going on for the Platinum Trophy. I'm almost getting close to 250 hours in the game. I absolutely love it, but apparently it has sold less than Remake launch aligned. I know that it has sold less domestically in Japan. Worldwide, it's also sold less too. Now, we can chalk that up to sequelitis, where essentially it is a sequel, right? It's a sequel to a planned trilogy, and then obviously, as much as people tell you don't have to, or Square Enix says, you do need to play the first game before you play this one. So, what does all of this mean, and why does Square Enix have this seesaw history of Final Fantasy and its sales targets, its critical reception, its commercial reception, and what can they do? In my personal opinion, I think they need to take Capcom's approach. If you look at Capcom's success within recent years, they have been doing incredibly well with Monster Hunter and Resident Evil. We're going to look more towards Resident Evil because it's more of a standalone single player game and not Monster Hunter, where it's obviously a little more online focused. But if we take a look at Capcom's sales numbers for Resident Evil games, they are the highest that they've ever been. I believe we've got almost every single remake. Even Devil May Cry 5 is selling tremendous. Devil May Cry 5 has actually outsold Final Fantasy VII Remake. Resident Evil Village has outsold Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is Resident Evil 2 Remake is nearing 15 million copies sold. We've got Resident Evil Village, which has sold 10 million units. We've got Resident Evil 3 Remake, which wasn't even received that well. A lot of people actually didn't like it. I thought it was fine, which has sold closer to 8 to 9 million units. We've got Resident Evil 2, which has done tremendously well. We've got Resident Evil 4 Remake with it just in the first year. I think it was 7.56 million sales just in the first year. I mean, these games are doing so well. Mind you, in terms of scope, they are definitely not as big as what you'd see with a JRPG, but here's what they have that Square Enix is lacking: consistency. All of these games are consistent. You know what to expect, you know what you're getting into, you know why you're buying the game, you know why you're going to enjoy it. And I think that is why these games have been so successful. Once Capcom changed to the RE engine and released Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and kind of revamped things, they've stuck with that consistency. Even though some games have been third person, first person, 8 was for first person, but they gave you the option with the gold edition and the DLC to change it to third person. Essentially, they've been consistent. Gameplay feels similar to what you'd expect from the previous game. They're consistently just improving upon each release, right? Staying with the same cadence and the same flow and the same gameplay and the same core values in each game, but just making it better. Whereas Square Enix is taking the approach where every Final Fantasy is so unique from the other, where you have 5 people who love 7 and you've got 10 people who've never played 8 and you've got 12 people who like 12. It's so much on and off, right? It's that seesaw. You have people jumping back and jumping forth, going on, going off. I didn't play 10 because it wasn't like 8. I didn't play 8 because it wasn't like 10, yada, 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 yada. And Square Enix is keeping this approach, which I think is really detrimental to the series because every game is rapidly different and you can be creative. You can be, and they proved that they could do that within the PS1 days, right? They were a bit different with each release, but they're never going to get past that glass ceiling if they don't find some consistency, especially in today's day and age where single player gaming is a little different. People want familiarity. They want to go in with something that they don't have time to kind of get reacquainted and try things, right? Especially as an adult with a full-time job and things going on in my life. It's like, oh, here's this new game that I'm really about to enjoy and I've got to get used to this. Build upon something that works. Use the formula from 16 and iterate and build upon that and use that, right? Use the combat system that's really well in Final Fantasy VII and Rebirth and build upon that and use that in your games going forward. I'm not saying, make the same exact game, but build upon what you already have to keep people coming back and grow that audience instead of, oh, here's Final Fantasy 17, which is rapidly different from 16. Who's going to buy this one? Who's going to like this one? It's going to be all over the place, right? And that's why the fandom in Final Fantasy is so divided too, because you have so many opinions on these games. It is just all over the place of who likes this game. You could take a look at Resident Evil, and for the most part, I know 5 and 6 get a lot of crap. most people are pretty much on the same page with a lot of the games in that, right? Because of the consistency of what they are. And I think Square Enix really needs to take that approach. And I'm not saying get rid of creativity and don't try new things, but stay consistent for a little bit, build upon something, grow an audience, bring more people back into the series, rejuvenate it, and then let's start changing things up a little bit. Because right now it's really, really rocky. And Final Fantasy is one of my personal favorite series, and I really want to see it grow. I want to see it continue to grow, right? Essentially, imagine the Final Fantasy 17 trailer release and it's something rapidly different from 16, right? So we can just theorize that there's already 3 million people that might say, what the heck? This is not like the one I just played. I'm not buying this. Boom. Then we could have another 2 million who say, oh man, I really like this. This is a lot different from what I played previously, but I'll try this one out, right? So there's no continuance, right? There's no essential movement forward, right? It's and I get it. Every entry is independent, stands on its own legs. That's completely fine, but we definitely need consistency. And I think if Square Enix could take a page out of Capcom's book and just stay consistent, improve upon what you've already done, especially now because Rebirth and 16 have been reviewed very well. Build upon that. Continue to build upon that and make it work. And then in a little bit get creative and do a little bit of things here and there. But these diminishing returns are hurting the series tremendously, and nobody wants that. Me being a big fan of the series, I want it to grow and grow and grow and grow. And if, in my personal opinion, the biggest reason I made this video is essentially just hoping Square Enix can find consistency and stay within that realm and build upon what they already have. Then once they've done that and they've reestablished the franchise and rejuvenated it and got some new people on board and sales numbers are looking a little better, make some changes and some tweaks and get creative again and be a little more unique. But I think right now, consistency needs to be the biggest thing that Square Enix can do with the Final Fantasy the Final Fantasy series, to get it back to where it was, right? And to potentially go past that glass ceiling. Now, also, just on a side note, a little bias here, I would like to see it go back turn-based, but I know that that's probably not going to happen. I think they could test the waters with that. I've always thought that it would be cool if they did like a Final Fantasy VI or like a Final Fantasy I remake in turn-based, just to kind of gauge and see. Apparently rumors are that the Final Fantasy IX remake will be turn-based, so it'll be interesting to see how people react to that and how that does, because that could be an indicator of, oh shoot, like, hey, maybe people do prefer to be turn-based, right, and not action or whatever the heck you'd call 15. I know that was technically an action game, but the action quality in that was a little all over the place. And I'll have a video actually out talking about that soon. But anyway, I've been rambling for too long. I want to wrap this up. Thank you guys for listening to me go on about my favorite series, or one of my favorite series, and what I think Square Enix could do to change it in the future. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.